Thank
I,
you.
oh,
So
so I
I
read
had a
over
number of
the.
thoughts.
Uh
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that did a good job of pasting together the transcript from the last one. It actually doesn't look too bad.
Oh,
There's,
good. Thank
I'll
you.
go through the parts that I did just to correct a few factual things, and you know, but
Yeah, I was
otherwise
hoping
you
you
did a good
would.
job putting it together. Yeah.
I thought what we could do today, because I think it would be too much to expect that Alex is going to give us another transcript, but I do want to have this recording just in case,
Mhm.
both for us to refer to and just in the far event that we could get a second transcript. I
Mhm.
wanted to review some of the main points I thought where we both converge and diverge in our thinking.
Right.
And then what I thought was we should, once we have that a little bit clarified, we might just each go off on our own and double check that we've got the edits correct and that things are clear and that we're happy with what we can produce as a final product.
Yeah, I think
That,
the transcript has a lot of interesting stuff in it that we can edit a little bit.
yeah.
It's not. It's obviously sort of free association and rambles around a lot. I'm not sure if there's anything we can do to give it more of a theme or a structure. Maybe that's not necessary. It's supposed to be
Well, I
conversation.
actually
So.
kind of like the informality of it,
Mhm.
and
It's informal, that's for sure.
and what I was hoping was that there was enough of a back and forth as we segued from talking about your work to talking a little bit about my work that
Mhm.
it would engage an audience in in our conversation.
Can I just
Yeah. Do you
interrupt
have
real
any
quickly?
thoughts?
I'm sorry,
Ray, do
Daisy.
you
What
want
did you
to
say?
Ray, do you want to share your webcam?
Oh, I'm not sharing it right now.
No.
No, I think you might have to click on something that says start sharing, or
Yeah,
you
I'm
might be
looking
able to
for
see
that.
yourself, but we can't see you.
No, I see Aviva and I don't see myself. I did see myself
Okay.
before. So the webcam is on. I'm just not currently sharing it.
Okay, so look at the
Um,
top of the video where you can see Aviva, and you should be able to see a button that says start, and it has a little webcam
oh,
icon.
yeah, right. Okay. That's a webcam, not a. There we go. Oh, now I see myself and not Aviva, but
And then you should be able to see something that says share your webcam or something like that.
I'm sharing.
Oh, there
Okay.
you go.
There we
Now
go.
we see us
All
both
right.
side by side. Okay, good.
Great.
Okay,
Aw.
good.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Wait,
So,
backwards. No, that way.
and
Trying to do.
interrupt me, Ray, if you think that I'm sort of going off track from what interests you, or there's something that you want to focus on that I'm missing. Okay.
Mhm.
Good. So, after thinking a lot, after going through the edits and then thinking a lot about it, these were the three things that I thought were important with some subheadings. One is that we both seem to be interested in a particular taxa or species
Oh yeah.
that
Oh, the
are
different. Uh-huh.
that are
Mhm.
both indicators to some extent and triggers for restoration. For
Mhm.
example, your interest in brassica or mine in fish.
Mhm.
So that was one big category, which I didn't really talk about too much in my own narrative, but I think I have to touch on it. Then the
So, is there
second,
anything that's equivalent on land that you're interested in? Since this is supposed to be
that's
a
a good
soil
question. That's a
conversation,
really
but
good question.
you did a lot of
Uh,
restoration on land, did all those gardens around your home.
yeah, but the goal was really to restore aquatic systems.
Mhm.
And what I was interested in terms of the soils, was the relationship between the water and the land that creates
Mhm.
soil. Um,
Okay, so other than the wetlands, you were interested in the water and the land. I mean, once you get away from the below wet areas, um, I guess you're talking about rain and runoff and things. Huh?
Well, I was more specifically interested in flushing, tidal flushing,
Oh, okay. Mhm.
and the kind of sedimentation that
Mhm.
occurs over long geological periods
Mhm.
that wears down rock to make
Sure.
soil,
Mhm.
and how that combines with animal activity and so on that
Mhm.
would create a fertile system. So I think we're both interested in the process of making fertile soil, pardon me, but perhaps coming at it from very different points of view.
But you're interested mostly in the estuary and the wetland, building up the wetland from the sea.
Yeah, I think one
So.
of the big
Mhm.
differences between our approaches is it seems to me that you're much more hands-on pragmatic. Like
Mhm.
you'll go out and find the sulfur or the Epsom salts.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in how the whole system works,
Mhm.
and to some extent, theoretically, where precisely must we or can we intervene to interrupt the whole system, or specifically the degradation of the whole system.
Mhm. And you're
Um,
interested in working with natural systems and trying to restore them.
right, but
I
I'm
work
very
mostly with
interested.
agriculture, yeah,
Well, you're interested in agriculture.
and I do a little bit of work with tidal marshes actually.
Oh, you do?
Published a couple of papers there. I've collaborated in some research in the Blackwater tidal marsh. It's a
Okay,
very large tidal marsh area in Maryland on the eastern shore of
right.
Maryland, adjacent to the Chesapeake Bay, and we're losing it. It's becoming open water.
Right, I know. I
Sea
followed
level
the
is
Chesapeake
rising
Bay for
around it.
about 20 years. It's
Yeah.
pretty interesting stuff. I'd love to see your
Mhm.
papers if you want to um, forward them
Yeah,
to
we
me.
we were looking at the impacts of they have a program of annual burning
Right.
to stimulate below ground growth and to improve the habitat for well, they're trying to control some invasive mammals and improve the habitat for the native mammals. So,
Okay. So that's one category, the role of particular taxa or species in our approaches.
and you have a
Then the
particular fish
second big,
that's working for you? Do
pardon
you
me?
have a particular? Is there a particular fish that's working for you?
Well,
Or just
I'm
in
pretty
general?
interested in cod and the relationship between Carcinus manus and cod. Some of my dissertation work was specifically on that, modeling with GIS some of the relationships between species abundance and the extent to which cod are declining. Although obviously cod are declining from overfishing and mercury, there's the other problem of biological community and invasive species,
Mm-hmm.
and the extent to which humans are agents in that process, as you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Okay. So your second point?
the second point was how we both deal with scale, which I thought was really interesting. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that um, the way in for you has been to work with agricultural systems. Is that pretty much correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
And
Um,
I usually enter. It's interesting thought of the entry point rather than do things in a kind of a large theoretical policy basis. I usually enter with the individual farmer, whether that's
mhm.
a small scale farmer in Africa or large scale farmers in the U.S. And it's through these relationships with individual farmers who manage land that you can kind of snowball things. As farmers teaching farmers is a much more effective way than trying to have outsiders do it.
That's
So
for sure.
and these are people that either own the land or live on the land and have very close relationships with the land. It's their livelihood. Yeah.
Well, Aviva,
Right.
that's very similar to entering in the small, like a trigger point.
Yeah, it is. But I think what Ray is saying, that's well, yeah. What I hear Ray saying is that he enters through the individual personal relationships, whereas I tend to enter through a biogeographic theoretical approach, and then narrow it down to a process of identifying a site that would function as a trigger point. But you're right. I think what we're both looking for might be the point of leverage or the point of catalyst, because obviously it's impossible to deal with the entire Mississippi water basin head on. You have to find someplace where you're going to start. So
so you're starting at the bottom end, is that right? Down in Louisiana, or are you starting at the top end up in Iowa?
What got me interested in the whole region was Katrina. And when I started looking into that and studying it, I started working with Gene Turner. I probably mentioned his name before. And I asked Gene if we were going to deal with the dead zones as one byproduct of climate change, which I'd been interested in and had contributed to Katrina. Where would you start? And he said Iowa. So then
usually you have to start at the top of the watershed.
Right. Well, specifically in terms of the system of factory farms and the release of nitrates. So then working with him and Jim White from Instar, we just kept diagramming that region to figure out, well, where is the entry point? And then when I got offered a chance to work on something in Memphis, we looked at, well, could we think of Memphis as a midpoint? And if so, how? And if that's true, where in Memphis would a trigger point be that would relate to the rest of the system? And what we looked at was the connection between the Wolf River and the Mississippi, which the Army Corps of Engineers, in its infinite wisdom, decided to interrupt.
The connection?
Yeah.
They have levees along there. Yeah.
Well, they established a wharf, basically, for boats. So there's no flushing right there. And partly as a consequence, there's flooding of the lowlands, for example, in 2011, which, if you had a chance to take a look at that video, there's a shot of the flooding.
Yeah, I saw the video.
So that's the second big one, where we enter the problem of scale. And then the third was our methodologies to do that. And where I saw a confluence was that we both use maps. In some ways the same, because we both use some GIS, and in some ways differently. But even in the ways that they're different, they might have some similarities. For example, I presume that you do some participatory mapping, right?
Sometimes in Africa, yeah. It's not. I've never done it in the U.S.
Right. And then
is that
kind of
something you do in communities in the U.S.?
Yeah. When I was in Memphis in 2013, for example, we did some participatory mapping, and one of the issues that emerged in terms of how we might deal with the Wolf River was the problem of racism, that there's very little incentive to reconnect the tributaries because there's not an equivalent concern for how the lowlands are flooded and how poor black residents of that area would be impacted. It's outweighed by the stakeholders that want to develop the riverfront and maintain that interruption of the tributaries.
That's a
And so
common
that,
political problem.
pardon me?
I said it's a pretty common political quandary, where you have
Yeah, yeah. That
kind of
definitely goes
division.
to adaptive management. And then, so a subcategory is how we perceive the situations that we try to enter and how we negotiate the adaptive management or working with stakeholders. So, for example, within that context, we're both interested in visuals. You take photographs. I think your photographs are really interesting. I take photographs also, but then I also create these objects like these paintings that, for me, are devices to just, and for myself and other people, just think about what are these relationships.
So talk a little more about how the art, the paintings, and the things you do with the photographs enter into your interventions in the natural system.
Thank you. For example, the recent encaustics that I did that involve images of fish. I often think that an artist's system of approach is very much like mathematics. You abstract the perception of what you're thinking about, and as you think through that abstraction and come to some sort of an elegant solution, you discover some new knowledge. But the new knowledge from an equation or an algorithm is really different than what it looks like to practically change things. A formula doesn't look anything like a restored marsh, but it can contribute to thinking about how you're going to restore the marsh. So I guess that Daisy's about to upload one of the encaustics, so I can try to explain how that works.
Yep. Yeah.
But for example, there was one little encaustic painting I did over the summer that has two floating fish over a bunch of broken sticks and some vivid reds and blues. And what I was doing was just working with, well, here's one that's a little simpler. Daisy, can you bring up that red fish one?
Sure.
Thank you. So what I was thinking about was simply the idea that we're losing cod and how I felt about global warming. The image, in a sense, was very, very abstract. But what emerged from me, if I think about the image as a mathematical formula, was just how intense that is. Just how grief-stricken I feel about losing the fish, about all the broken habitat. Now, how that informs the way I approach restoration thinking, there it is. Can we zoom in a little bit on that, Daisy?
Sure.
I can see it pretty well on the big screen.
Great. Thanks. So the extra dimension this adds is simply the turmoil of how we're going to deal with this. It's, I think, so emotionally fraught. The loss of jobs for fishermen, for example. The loss of traditional lifestyles, not just for fishermen, but for so many other peoples around the world, which I'm sure you're more than familiar with, especially in Africa. The sense of loss of beauty of clean water, of relatively pristine habitat, of species in general. To me, the sense of desolation that emerges from contemplating that becomes part of what I have to bring to the participatory mapping, to the thinking about how to negotiate with stakeholders. If, for example, one of the stakeholders is I think Bass Pro is one of the big corporations that has developed the riverfront around Memphis. Um, Somehow I have to bring in that anguish without guilting them, but engage them somehow in their willingness to be part of the solution instead of the problem. I don't know if that's too abstract. Does that pretty much explain how it helps? It's more subjective. It's more heuristic.
Hmm. And have they changed their attitudes or their actions on the waterfront?
Well, I haven't spoken to them since 2013. I think they were willing to talk in 2012 and 2013. Honestly, most of what I've done since, besides finish up my dissertation, is try to get funding to move forward with that project,
Hmm.
which, needless to say, in these times has been less than easy.
So there's no way to make it self-supporting. If you could
The
find
projects
some
that I do?
synergy with the with the you want to redevelop that part of the river or restore
Right.
the connection. Is there any way to do that so that it's self-supporting, so that the developments along the river are changed, that they're still making enough money to finance those changes?
Those are really good questions, and I don't know the answers. Um, so far, we've just been trying to build some of the coalitions between people who live in the main part, the center of Memphis, and people who are located on the fringes and the lowlands. I think that's going to be a strategic conversation that we have to have. There are a number of groups that are already talking about that, and the work that I did there in 2013, from what I hear, advanced the conversation. But there's a lot more to talk about, and needless to say, this is a conversation that's not specific to Memphis. I'm sure you've
Right.
encountered
Right.
it as well.
Yeah, you encounter it all over, but I think for a solution to be sustainable beyond a particular project, it really needs to be self-sustaining, self-funding. So
Oh, I agree.
whether there's possibility of interesting fishermen and hunters in preserving some of these wetland systems and having the proceeds go to the people that live there, or have them get involved with either renting their lands or serving as guides or something like that, so that the attributes of the different classes of people involved will be more interests will become more aligned, and some of the resources will flow into it voluntarily.
That's all true
That's
when you
kind of
get away from the urban centers, but this particular connection between the Wolf River and the Mississippi is
hmm
in effect in an urban area.
hmm
So then you get into somewhat more, well, different problems of urban planning,
hmm
and how do you start retrofitting coastal urban landscapes,
hmm
which I think is something, as many people know, that has to be done. And that does
hmm
bring us back to soil, obviously. You can't have soil if you have impervious infrastructure and hardscaping,
Right.
as you
Right.
know.
So that's the whole watershed has to be changed to change the hydrology. But there's usually money to be made in that. In other words, it increases the economic value as well. Both the waterfront
Absolutely.
improves and a lot of others. So if it's done right, it can be profitable.
Oh,
But
absolutely. No, I
in our
totally
society,
agree
if
that.
it's not profitable, it's basically only going to last as long as someone's willing to get taxed to do it, and that's always temporary.
No, absolutely,
Project.
absolutely. But that's a separate problem for me from sustaining my own process in moving the project forward.
Mm-hmm.
So we're trying to advance on both fronts. Both.
So how do you participate as an artist? Are you working in this mostly as an activist, a political social activist, or is somehow your artwork involved? Like I don't know, have you done some public art in Memphis or done some showings or murals
Well,
or something of that nature as your you know tool or weapon?
I think that goes to defining what an ecological artist is. Uh, an
Hmm.
ecological an ecological artist is less interested in producing the objects than we are in the process of change. My background is, as a young artist, was in performance art.
Hmm.
So interacting with people, thinking through these processes, conceptualizing uh, the level of activism, I consider all these part of my practice.
Hmm. Yeah. So if you do performance art, then you're used to things being ephemeral. Uh,
Yeah, somewhat ephemeral and certainly interactive,
mm-hmm.
and very much about the subjective drama of the situation, the conversation between the initiator and the audience. And for me, the conversation between the catalyst, the audience, and the landscape, I
Mm-hmm.
consider
So
that very much a performance.
so tell me a little more about the relationship with the landscape because I think that's what we're trying to focus on in this book is the land and the soil and the landscape. So this is a case where you have a landscape. I guess it's a riparian landscape, or are you thinking of the whole watershed and the hydrology that impacts that in the city of Memphis?
In Fish Story, which is the project that emerged for the Mississippi Water Basin, um, part of the interaction is conceptual in terms of observing the dynamics. Part of it is the social interaction, and part of it is being on site. And, for example, in 2013, canoeing the Wolf River as far as we could get towards the Mississippi, and noticing um, what kinds of species had been taken out of the system. For example, most of the canopy trees were gone, which meant that the water was relatively dead relative to where it had been pre-industrialization, about 1930, when that started. There are accounts of looking through the water to the sandy soil, which at one time was pure white, and then after they developed mills and other industries along the water, it became black. And to this day, I don't think very much of it is white.
This is
So,
the sand on the bottom.
right. So,
Has any
obviously, I'm
do you
sorry,
get
go ahead.
involved in do you get involved with scientists who are measuring the health of the stream with benthic organism counts and
Oh,
things like
yes,
that?
of course. Of course. Um, I don't describe myself as a scientist by any means, but I do try to be informed about the science and to work with scientists to think differently about systems. Um, and I consider that part of the performative process also, how we might affect each other or learn from each other.
So how much either do you or your people you work with diagnose both what's wrong with the river and you know how that came to be and is it a matter of toxic chemicals? Is it a matter of clearing the vegetation in the riparian zone? Is it erosion from the uplands? Dredging? What? All of the above,
Well, all of the
probably.
above. In the
Yeah.
case of the Wolf River and that region, there's been an invasion of privet, and that's mostly why they've lost the canopy trees. And then, of course, there
So
can
this
be no
wasn't something people did on purpose. This was just an accidental escape.
mostly accidental escape, as far as I understood it. It was considered a nice garden thing.
Oh yeah, a lot of people have in their garden.
Yeah, and then there you are. So at one point I was in touch with Shelby Farms, which is working on a very large restoration project there, and they're pretty much focused on eradicating the privet. So I was able to see what they were up to. As you know, you have to pick your battles, and that's basically what we're talking about. Where is the point of entry where you can pick your battle to have the most effective result? I'm still thinking that the most important part might be reconnecting the tributary. And then the fish become indicators for how successful that approach might be.
Is there fish that come up the Mississippi and up the?
Oh yeah,
the other way down?
Yeah, and like with the ocean and other parts, they've dramatically overfished them, but they're also subject to a lot of pollution from nitrates. Not so much from industry, I don't think, at this point. But then the question is whether the populations can recover. So a lot of the Mississippi is being periodically restocked.
Mm-hmm. And the nitrates are coming primarily from the farmland, right?
Right.
Which is not so actually we have a closer connection than you think, because the best way to control the nitrates is to introduce cover crops, which is just starting to happen in the Midwest.
Which I think is terrific. I think your work sounds really important and like a very effective response.
And it's interesting because one part of the country doesn't seem to pay much attention to the other parts. We've had this problem in Maryland and taken pretty strong public policy action for about 25 years, and the Corn Belt and the Midwest, Illinois and Iowa states, Tennessee and states along the Mississippi are just now starting to look at the things that we were looking at in the Chesapeake region 20 years ago. So they're really about 20 years behind. It does take a long time to change the actual outputs, but I think to me it amazes me that they don't just look over and see what's happening in other countries and other regions and say, hey, obviously that would work here too, or we have some misconceptions. So the Midwest, until very recently, in fact, they still are over applying nitrogen fertilizers in a way that they don't need to. That's not working to the advantage of their farmers. So they can actually be just as profitable and more so with less of that nitrogen. You just have to learn how to do it. So as I mentioned last time, there are a few pioneering farmers in the Midwest that are starting to do this, and it's starting to catch on. So I think that'll have a big sort of basin-wide impact.
I think there's also an issue of how we approach these problems. For example, in my dissertation, what I tried to do was develop a complex adaptive model. And in the revision request I got after my Viva, one of the points somebody brought up was that there are different understandings of complexity and relationships between agents. I think that what you're talking about is also about how people do perceive models as agents in interaction. So as you said, the Chesapeake Bay is one kind of model, or there might be another model in Africa, but there are these confluences between the thinking. And the real task, I think, for many of us is to get people to think in terms of the whole systems and the relationships in whole systems, rather than it's Africa over here and it's Chesapeake Bay over there and Mississippi River Basin over here, that even though the agents may be different, even though their relational dynamics might be different, the way we have to approach them might be the same.
Yeah, I think it even goes more specific than that. Some of the solutions will be the same. It just takes a while.
I agree.
So So in this example, what's kind of incredible is that Maryland and the Chesapeake area, but particularly Maryland, realized back in the 80s um, that what was hurting the Chesapeake Bay was primarily nutrients, and it's fairly easy to take care of the sewage plants because you could just pass a law and pass some taxes and get it done. But that most of the remaining nutrients are coming from farms, and so this required changing the way we were thinking. So when I first started at the University of Maryland, the university was encouraging farmers to put on more manure and more fertilizer. And a lot of this was based on what I now know is faulty research, although they're continuing to do it in the Midwest. And they started changing once they changed that policy. Some of the same people that had been encouraging farmers to use more were now tasked with encouraging them to use less. They had to sort of reverse their arguments, and they had to actually show they could use less without uh, compromising their production and their profits. In fact, they might actually be more profitable. No one really wants to waste the money on the fertilizer that goes down the Mississippi. And year after year, the fertilizer rates went down, and the yields continued to go up, which made it pretty clear case for the fact that fertilizers had been overused, and that they were just needed to dial back. But decades went by, and so we cut our fertilizer use probably by 40%, 30-40% or so, while yields continue to go up, and they're still comparable to what they get in the Midwest. But this didn't make an impression on the people in the Midwest. They continued to, both the governments and universities and advisors recommended more, and the farmers used,
Why
the
do
high
you think
levels.
that is?
Well, I think they needed to have their own local experience and research. They just didn't translate that, and say, oh, this is what they've learned in Maryland, is that they could cut back with it, and it was really unnecessary. They're now starting to approach that, but like 20 years later.
So that's, I think, one of the big problems.
We're the same country. We're just a different region.
I think one of the big problems, and I think one reason why we're having this conversation and contributing to Alex's book, is that we don't have 20 years anymore. We have to find ways into these large systems that work faster. And I think the two approaches that we're talking about, one is perhaps more theoretical and macro, or based more in complexity, and one is more immediately pragmatic, like the use of brassicas. We have to somehow marry these approaches. We have to marry the heuristic and the quantitative in ways that people can relate to. That was one reason why I focused on the fish, because honestly, people can relate to fish more easily than they can to brassicas. And if they don't have fish on their dinner table or dinner plates, they're usually a little bit more concerned than if they don't have brassicas.
Well, from a food item, yeah. But
right.
When we're talking about the people that are responsible for the nitrogen in the Mississippi, they're more interested in what the plants on the land than on the fish. They don't eat much fish anyway.
Right, but you have to find some way for the general population to be part of this conversation. You have to find some way for the ordinary person to find their own point of entry. It's one thing for us to talk about the methodologies of restoring soil or changing tributaries. It's another thing entirely for this to happen in the lifetime of somebody whose dinner plate is going to be changing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And unfortunately, these natural processes take a long time to change. I mean, we know that even when we change the practices, there's enough, for instance, in the example in Mississippi of nitrogen in the pipeline that is in the groundwater already and the profile
Right.
on its way to that it's probably going to take decades to flush it out so that before you actually see a change uh, in the total impact down in the dead zone. So
But surely
even
you
if we
agree
started
that we
doing
have to.
everything right overnight, it would take probably decades for the rivers to recover and to see that
Right.
change, which makes it politically difficult because you don't see the results very quickly.
Well, that's why I think you have to find some way to hook people's imagination. Not just, I shouldn't say not just, but in addition to the large agricultural people that are dealing with big swaths of land, you have to somehow engage normal people, like Daisy, for example. Daisy, you're a pretty normal person. You have to be engaged in how we're going to solve these problems and how you're part of that, that you're not just a passive victim of agribusiness or corporations. I always put Daisy on the spot like this.
Yeah, well, in a sense, that's the when you're saying the common person or the multitude of people, that's a political issue. You want them to be aware so that they'll elect representatives that will support
No, I want them
policies that will
engaged.
do
I
this.
want them
I mean,
engaged in the restoration process. I want them restoring ecotones.
but if the problem is dumping too many, I mean, the fundamental problem with the Mississippi Basin and the dead zone is dumping too much nitrogen in the river,
Right.
and that's coming from these big farms. Those are the ones that are going to solve that part of the problem. Talking about you know waterfront development on the Wolf River, that's more of a local development, and you're going to have a lot of local people involved in that. But in terms of the nutrients coming down the Wolf River, it's probably all the farms up in the watershed there where that's going to have to change. So,
Well, as you know,
people,
some of it is changing because people are just more interested in more organic food. They're less interested in the way Oscar Mayer produces their pork sausage.
well, I mean, but that's if you look at the impact that that's having on the Mississippi watershed, you can't measure it. It's so small.
But we have to somehow take all these approaches and marry them. We can't just have one approach. There's too large a problem for us to just rely on one solution.
Oh, no, the many solutions, but for that aspect of it, in terms of like where's the leverage point, I think you want to work with the people who are causing the problem.
Oh, I agree with you. I agree with you entirely
So,
on that.
if the problem is urban hydrology, then you need to involve, millions of people that live in the city and to change the hydrologic flow from urbanized areas or we've already engaged them in terms of the nutrients and the pollutants from sewage, so that a lot of money is spent to treat sewage. A lot less comes out, even though we have a pretty illogical arrangement for dealing with our wastes, put it that way. But I think when we're talking about these rivers, they're mainly impacted by what happens on the watershed over large areas of land, and that's either land that's controlled by farmers. In the case of the Mississippi, it's almost all farmland. So the people that are going to make a difference are those people that you're calling factory farms, but they're large farms, and they're the ones that control the millions of acres in the watershed and will make a difference. And I think they will. I think they're starting to wake up, both from an environmental point of view, but also from their own self-interest in the long run.
But don't you agree that if consumers begin to pressure these large farmers, that would have an impact also?
Not really on a watershed-wide basis. So
well, if people don't buy Oscar
impacts,
Mayer's products, you don't think that's going to have an impact on them?
I don't think so. No. The most of this land is involved in producing commodities primarily to feed animals. A lot of it's exported overseas. The kind of thing that you get, you know, the urban uh, foodie movement affects a lot of small farmers in urban areas, primarily vegetables, you know, which is a minuscule part of the land in the Mississippi Basin. It would be, if it was California, it would be a little bit more important in the Central Valley of California, where the nation's vegetables
Well, you
are
make the
grown.
point in the transcript that most of the land is being used to create feed.
Yes. Now, if
So,
everybody became vegetarian in the world, that would certainly change the picture. I'm not sure it would change it for the better, but it would change the picture. And if everybody wanted grass-fed beef, that would change the picture. If you could actually get a mass movement. But let's put it this way, you know, while these organic food and, you know, the slow food and, you know, the better food movement is impacting what a very small minority eats, the world economy is going in the other direction
so you're
by a
basically
vast
saying that
proportion.
you don't see a role for the ordinary person, that it's all about power relationships and policy. Is that correct? Am I hearing you correctly?
No, that's not what I mean. But I think the role that the ordinary person had, or I don't know what the word ordinary means. If you're referring to, in the case of the Mississippi, it's really mostly a question of agriculture. In other watersheds, there are a lot of other types of land use, but the Mississippi watershed is almost, you know, the vast majority of the land that impacts the river is in agriculture, and the vast majority of that's in animal feed production, soybeans and corn. And so
So
it's how that
where can
soybeans and
somebody
corn are produced.
intervene who doesn't have large power? Do you see any point, or do you think that this all comes down to power?
Well, I don't see it as a question of power. As I said before, I think to solve this problem, we need to appeal to and find solutions that are congruent with the interests of those large-scale farmers that are
But that's
control the millions of
power.
acres of land.
But isn't that power?
I, because they own the land,
Yeah.
or actually they don't often own the land. Most farmers rent most of their land. So the actual land owners probably are Wall Street investors or investors in Japan or China, or retired farmers now living in Florida that still have 1,000 acres in Iowa and they're renting it out. So most of the large-scale farmers are renting most of their land and they own a small proportion of it. They can't afford to
So
buy
let
it.
me switch the conversation a little bit because
So
I don't want
I guess to solve the
Yeah.
to solve the Mississippi water quality problem in the dead zone, you really need to understand and deal with the sort of agricultural community and system that's governing the watershed. That's much harder for most urban people to deal with than the urban part of it, but the urban part of it has largely been taken care of as best they can. I mean, the main problem is now agricultural.
So I agree with that. So my question is, because I'm not sure how long you want to talk today, but we've talked for
Okay.
almost an hour already.
Yeah, we probably should.
So my question is, how does or could a conversation like we're having now, that's going to become part of this book that Alex is producing, how can that be a point of intervention? How do you see it as a possible point of intervention in any of these systems that we're talking about? I have my own thoughts, but I want to hear yours first.
Yeah, well, I think the people that are involved don't understand each other's worlds. So for some environmental problems, it's very much the people in the city that are involved. You know, whether they recycle their things, what they do with their garbage, what they do with their, for that matter, you know, whether they flush their toilets and, you know, a lot of other, how much water they use, the way they live every day, you know, for the vast majority of urbanites. But most of these people don't understand the agricultural system in the hinterland at all. And in the case of the dead zone, and most of what's wrong with the Mississippi has to do with that agricultural system. That most of the people living in the system live in urban areas, and they really don't understand what's going on. The farmers, on the other hand, don't have any contact with the Gulf, and they don't understand too well what's going on either in the environmental impacts. So there's, we need to foster some more communication and some more, uh, I guess, some kind of cross experience, uh, so so people have a little bit better understanding of these systems, so that they can appeal to them and work with them and find solutions that they're not going to be resistant to.
So you think if the farmers could see what the damage that they were causing was doing, they might be more responsive?
Well, that happened. For instance, the water flows the other way in the upper part going into Lake Erie. So in the last year, there's been the effects on the water quality in Lake Erie, with the toxic algal blooms that took drinking water away from about 1 million people in Toledo, Ohio area, and that kind of thing. Farmers became very much aware of that, and they are, starting to get serious now about understanding that. In the case of Lake Erie, it's a different issue, though. In the case of Lake Erie, it's a phosphorus issue, which involves different measures to be taken. But they have become very much aware of it, and they are trying to deal with it. It's not something they can do overnight. In fact, the best practices to try to keep phosphorus from leaving the land and to reduce that use is, in a practical way, is really hasn't been worked out for all of those soils. Where there's a lot of science that still needs to be done.
Well, just to answer your question a little bit more, Daisy, at the Restore America's Estuaries Conference that I was at in Tampa a few years ago, there was a film shown of farmers that were taken down to the Gulf of Mexico, and they saw the devastation of the dead zones and the impacts of their overuse of nitrogens. And they came away saying that they plan to change their practices. So to me, this goes back to incorporating the visceral experience of what this all means. It's one thing to talk about phosphorus. It's another thing to look at dead animals or dead people, for that matter.
I think in the case of Lake Erie, they didn't have to go very far. This was happening in their own state, often in their own counties, not very far. So I think it did have an impact. They had a similar program with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, took farmers from the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, where they produce a lot of chickens and cattle, and took them down to meet the watermen who do make their living catching crabs and fish in the bay. And they spent a week and kind of opened their eyes to each other's issues. So I think that's part of it, just seeing that. But I don't think you can expect business people who are making their living off the land and with pretty tight margins to do things that are going to cost them a lot of money, and so that instead of making money, they're losing money.
So I think a lot of what we've talked about...
You have to find a way to interest them in finding something that's going to affect this change, but do it in a way that's going to be profitable for them.
Oh, absolutely.
Otherwise, they can't do it.
So I think what we've been talking about today and the relationship between the science and art of approaching these problems has been all the ways that soil becomes an intersection of these problems and these solutions. And I think it's been pretty interesting to explore them with you, Ray.
So I think, I think almost all the problems we have with water in close to land and rivers originates on the land, in the soil.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Like the waterfront developments. So there needs to be a lot more communication so that people kind of understand a little better what's going on in the vast areas of land that feed the water into the rivers to impact that. Well, hopefully we'll be able to, if not get a transcript, at least a recording of this, and try to use some of today's conversation to organize what we talked about last time. come up with a chapter.
I think we can. We did record it. And what is your feeling? Do you think it would be worth having a transcript of this conversation as well?
I think it would be useful. Yeah, the transcript looked, about looked like 50 or 60% of it was usable stuff that just needed to be edited down. So yeah, that would be great. Is that actually being done by hand, or is it sort of automatic?
I have no idea how Alex is doing it.
I mean, if they're running it through a computer program, I think there must be a human, because I noticed when I discussed
there's
that
some
green
typos.
Manure in Africa, the species name Makuna, which is the viney legume that I talked about in Africa.
I was wondering about that.
It was written as Lacana, which is a legume tree. And for a minute I thought I
noticed
must have
that, and I wondered.
I don't think I did. So I think there must have been whoever wrote the transcript must have known something about it and just got the wrong kind of plant. So without seeing the pictures. Okay. Anyway, let's see what we can do. If we can get the transcript, it'd be great. We can ask Alex. I don't know.
Yeah, I think we've finally got to something that was a little bit more substantive today.
So I think maybe we can kind of weave this in and put it together. Let's give that a try.
And I'm not sure how we're going to work out the visual thing. I haven't heard back from Alex.
The fish over the bloody sticks ought to be in there someplace. I like that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
And at some point, if we continue we meaning the other scientists that I work with, can continue our work on Memphis, I'd love to have you engaged in one of our conversations and see where that takes us, because you have a very different approach.
Okay. Good. We'll keep in touch. All right. So we should try to get the transcript, and I'll work a little bit on editing the one that you started, and see if we can't put it together. Okay?
Okay.
All right.
Well, this has been very interesting.
Funding for Memphis.
Thank you. Okay. It's been very interesting.
Congratulations on passing your orals.
Thank you very much. And I've really enjoyed getting to know something about your work. I think it's very important and very interesting, and I've appreciated your openness to learn something about my own work.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. I enjoy it.
Thank you.
It's great. Okay.
Thank you very much. So, to be continued.
To be continued.